Hello, everyone, and welcome to this seminar of the Research about Learning in Higher Education Centre. I'm delighted today to introduce Dr. Alison Purvis, who's going to lead our session about ethics and quality and power and transparency in educational research. My name's Louise Taylor, and I'm Professor of Education and Student Experience at Oxford Brookes University, and I'm the Director of the Research Centre. And yeah, it's my pleasure to welcome Alison, who's an Associate Dean at Sheffield Hallam University. Um, and she was recently named in the AI 100 UK list, which sounds impressive. Well done, Alison. Yeah, and you're also incoming deputy editor-in-chief for the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice. So, and you're going to draw on some of the work you've done within that journal and some of the publications you've written for that journal in your talk today. So I'm delighted to welcome you, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction and for the invitation to talk today. So as Louise said, I'm going to draw on some work I've done in association with the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice, which is a top quartile educational research journal. I'm also a Director of Education at the Open Access Publishing Association, which is about 3 years old now and was originally born out of the editors at that journal, at the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice, to find a more sustainable home for the journal. And we do a lot of work around open access. And so all of the things that you see in this presentation are very much in that ethos of Creative Commons, shared resources and information. So yeah, I'm drawing upon a lot of that work. So what I'd like to talk about today is essentially how to use ethics and the process of ethics to actually improve your work and to improve the quality of that work. So I'm hoping this won't be too dry. You know, ethics isn't necessarily top of the list for exciting topics, but hopefully I can talk to you a little bit about how we can use ethics and ethical considerations to, like I say, improve quality and think about research in a much more purposeful way. So actually turn it into something that's much more useful for us. So I'm going to cover various aspects of this today. So I'm going to look at ethical standards. I'm going to explore research questions and how they can also be helpful in forming your research and ensuring quality. Look at artificial intelligence transparency also and think about authorship in that context too. I'm going to talk about power relations, think about educational research and how that might be an additional aspect compared to other types of research, how informed consent is really important, and challenges in studying one's own practice and one's own learners. So we'll hopefully bring all of this together. As you can see today, I'm using a Miro board, relatively new tool for me. I've used it once for a workshop recently and it seemed to be quite an effective tool. So I thought I'd introduce that today because it allows us to be interactive throughout the session. So you can, as we go through, you'll see I'll give you opportunities to contribute, to add your own thoughts to the Miro board. But please do feel free to ask questions. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat. And I'll also welcome any digital hands going up and we can have a conversation. So I just need to keep an eye on the time because they're some of my favourite subjects and as we all can get a little bit too impassioned about things and lose track of time. So Louise, please do keep me on track. So there's a lot of content on the board and I'm going to go through it bit by bit. If there's any comments, questions or feedback, you can add it to these red notes in the corner of the screen. I'll just post the link again in case I'm not quite sure with Zoom, sometimes it disappears if you've joined the chat after it's been posted. So just in case you've not got the link, there is the link to the Miro board. Okay, so let me start then by looking at how ethics is really part of the research design process. Now, if we say ethics, quite often you'll think about the ethics process at your institution, those dreaded forms or online portals that ask all kinds of questions. And you know, we can sort of let out that collective groan at the thought of these processes. But as I said at the start, let's rethink that, reposition or reframe that as an opportunity to really think about our research and our plans about how we can make those as good as they could possibly be, so that they are really getting to the answers for the questions that we have. So for me, ethical review isn't just that process, isn't a tick that we need to get in a specific box or be able to say when we publish that we've got ethical approval. It's very much that part of the design process and the thinking process. And certainly for me, rethinking it in that way and reframing it in that way has made it a lot better process, really, and feels a lot less bureaucratic and just ticking boxes. Because if we can use it in that way, then it becomes a much more responsible process, thinking about how we protect our participants and make sure the research is as valid as it possibly can be, and that we're asking them the right questions and trying to achieve the right kind of outcomes. And I'll touch upon concepts of trust and transparency throughout the session today, because they are the cornerstone for me about ethical practices and ethical considerations. So how do we trust the quality of our research and the processes that we're asking others to engage with, and how transparent are those processes that we're asking others to engage with? So good ethical research will emerge from good design and thinking about how we are setting the foundations for our research. And so a lot of the work that I've done is about research questions. And it was a topic a few years ago that, to be honest, I didn't really think a lot about. Often, certainly in our own institutional ethics process, we are asked for our research questions. So I'd always done them and thought about them. But it was only a few years ago when we started to write an editorial on the value of research questions that it really clicked for me just how important a simple question is for ethics and for the quality of research. It's all about that clarity of purpose. Are we really clear on the purpose of the research and the questions that we are asking? So for me, research questions really do shape that purpose, what we need, what we don't need, and what data we're trying to collect and what we shouldn't be collecting, because it doesn't focus us into the right particular area. So a focused research question that's really well thought through will reduce any unnecessary data collection. It also helps us avoid risks, burdens, and bias when we think about the questions that we're answering or asking and trying to answer as clearly as we can do. And that clear design then enables us to communicate the research more effectively, which of course is that cornerstone of transparency. And ultimately, participants understand what they're consenting to, why, and hopefully the benefit for them of taking part. So first bit of interaction that I'd like you to get involved with here is thinking about your own research, either research that you've currently got underway or research that you're planning, scholarship that you're planning, and you're starting to think about those research questions. Have a think about those, and do you feel that they are clear, focused, and justified questions? Do you know what your own research questions are? Do they pop off the top of your head because you've thought about them so much? How do those questions help you minimise burden on your participants? Have you thought very carefully about the focus of those questions? And how do those questions help you clarify the methods that are needed and the data that's ultimately collected to try and answer those questions? How are you seeking perspective using those questions as your starting point on your proposed research and methods? So if you want to ponder those as prompt questions and input onto those little kind of sticky note things, and you just need to click on one, I think it's double click, and then start to write. What are your thoughts about research questions and how much clarity are they giving you? Are you confident in writing research questions? Certainly it was something that I say a few years ago I possibly took a little for granted. It was only a research question. It was something that needed to go onto the form. But what are your thoughts about research questions right now? And is it something that's helping you to form your research methods, to form your data collection, and ultimately guide you through the process? And while you're giving that a little bit of thought, I'll just share the work that we did do about research questions. So this first diagram here is our model of developing and communicating research questions. And we took a 7-step approach to research questions and looked at how they actually can tell that story throughout the whole research process. And by revisiting research questions throughout a research process, it really helped to clarify each stage. And often questions need a reiteration later on in the research process. So it's not necessarily that your question will be perfect on day one. So when you submit that ethics application, those research questions should be well considered and should be good research questions. But it may be that as things progress, you are recognizing other things in the research process that requires a little bit of iteration. So I'll just show you the bigger model and I'll copy the link into the chat so you've got them easy. Oh, no, that's not copied. 1 second, let's try that again. No, it's not copying. You will be able to access it on the mirror board and just click it. I'm not sure why that's not copying. But here is the larger infographic, which goes into a lot more detail. And I won't go through it all because we certainly will run out of time very quickly. But just to highlight a couple of aspects here, that initial identification of the problem. So what is the problem that you're trying to solve? And that should draw on the research that you've done, the literature research that you've done, the things that you currently understand about the topic and the questions that you're attempting to answer. And then there's that iteration process of drafting the questions, exploring the methods that will answer those questions, and then thinking about, is the question still the right question? So there is that iterative element of developing research questions. So don't necessarily expect that the first question, the first time you've produced a question, it will be absolutely perfect. There is that opportunity to think, revisit, consider the connection to methods. But that's why research questions, in my opinion, are so critical, because they should guide each step. So what methods will answer this question? And then when the data collection is occurring, how am I applying this research question into this data collection and reflecting on the process and considering how that question is being answered or indeed otherwise? So thinking very much about that research question, answering what are the answers to the question as a key part or a cornerstone of that initial thinking for ethical considerations. So let's just have a quick look at some of the things that you are adding in. Yeah, research questions aren't always followed through, and that's critical. Why you need to keep revisiting them and considering, am I still answering that original question? And sometimes you might want to iterate the question and recognize that it wasn't quite right to start with. This isn't about manipulating the questions to fit the data that you're collecting, though. That's not what I'm suggesting here, because if it's that kind of thing is happening, there's something going wrong with your methods, something going wrong with your data analysis. But it is about thinking about the preciseness, the focus of those questions, and making sure they are pulling that narrative through as we go. Okay, right. So thank you for the comments. Just have a quick look at some of the others before I move on. Yes, absolutely. And certainly for early career researchers, research questions sound simple, but getting a research question right is actually quite challenging. And if you look at the paper, the editorial that we wrote on research questions, so if you follow this link, we have got some suggestions of research questions in there. So hopefully you'll find that quite a useful resource to get you started. You know, what does a good research question look like? So there should be some helpful content in there. Okay, thank you for the questions. I will, sorry, the comments. I will come back to those later, just conscious of time and making sure that I keep progressing through. But as I said earlier, if you do have questions, want to comment on anything, please do put something in the chat or put your digital hands up, and I will keep an eye out for that. Okay, so starting with the question then, what's the question that we're trying to answer? And then thinking about some of the connected factors to how effective research is when we're carrying it out, thinking about the power and relationships. And as I said at the beginning, this is possibly more of a dominant factor in educational research than it might be in other types of social science. But yeah, I think we could get into a long conversation about that. But it certainly is something that we need to consider in educational settings, because in those kind of settings we have inherent power differences. We have teachers and students, and even in the most collaborative, co-productive classrooms, there will always be a power imbalance between those two sets of groups, if you like. So when we're looking at educational research and we want to talk to our own students about interventions, about observations, about practices, those participants may feel obliged to take part because they are your students, and they possibly look up to you as the educator, as the teacher, the tutor. So feel obligated to take part in the research because you have asked them to. Or even if they think you're the most fantastic teacher, again, they feel obligated to do so, but they may also feel that obligation to respond in a certain way. And that, of course, means that consent isn't fully voluntary. They feel persuaded to take part when they may not wish to. So that takes a lot of thought and consideration, because taking on these roles of teacher and researcher, student and participant, will really influence data interpretation. You will bring your own perspective to it as an educator as well. So thinking very carefully about that, and is carrying out the research actually going to answer the question in an honest way, or is it going to be skewed because of these relationships? So I've suggested some mitigation strategies here. So you could use a third party, so another colleague perhaps who isn't directly involved with the students, to recruit students to whichever type of research activity is ongoing. That could be an option. Often students are concerned that their assessment grades will be impacted if they do or don't take part in some kind of research intervention or participation. So make sure that that is very clearly delineated, that students' assessment is not going to be influenced in any way by research. Sometimes that'll be easier than others. Providing clear, non-coercive opt-out routes so students don't feel compelled to take part if they don't, and that it's an easy choice for them. They don't feel obligated in any way. And again, so here they're about grades, but also the attendance isn't implicated in any kind of research activity as well. And then the final point here, and I know Louise has a lot of knowledge around this, and certainly expects this in the submissions to the papers that you look at, don't you, Louise? That they should have a reflexivity statement in your ethics application. If you're not familiar with that, I've put a brief definition there, but it's essentially about examining how your own bias, assumptions, your own connections, relationships and factors might be influencing the research process. And there always will be something that you're bringing to the research with you, even when you try and be as objective as you possibly can, and even when you recognise some of those biases and assumptions that you're bringing with you. So think about that. And I would include that in your ethics application as well, because that is a strong ethical consideration, that you have thought about your positionality and how it is influencing the research. You've thought about how those power dynamics, those relationships are being influenced because of your presence, because of your connections. So yeah, include a reflexivity statement and give that some thought as part of the process as well. So again, thinking about these reflective prompts, where are the power dynamics in your context? So again, thinking about some recent research that you've carried out, think about something that you're planning. Where are those dynamics? There will be there somewhere. So how are those dynamics going to be impacting your potential research or research that you've completed? How might you protect voluntary participation? Who might feel pressured to take part, and why might they feel pressured, and can you mitigate more effectively for those pressure points? I always try and think about benefit to participants, that there should be some more benefit to the participants than just the altruistic nature of taking part and helping somebody complete their research. There should be some other type of payback for that involvement. So is there mutual benefit built into your research project, or how can you improve the benefit that participants will achieve? And how can you ensure that students feel confident in their role as participant within the research? So again, if you ever think about those reflective prompts and add your thoughts into the little sticky notes here, thinking about power dynamics and relationships in your context, in your research, where have you come across that in the past? Where might it be coming up for you in some projects that you've got planned? And how can you try and mitigate for some of those dynamics? And I'll just take a quick sip of tea because my voice is starting to go. So again, for me, a real important aspect of ethical consideration, those dynamics within relationships. Thanks for the engagement in the comments. It's great to see these coming through. Yeah, it is often difficult, isn't it, to give beyond benefits to participants. We often see incentives, don't we now? Financial incentives, vouchers are very common, aren't they, in student educational research? But it's not always possible, and that in and of itself will change that dynamic and that relationship with the participants in research as well. Again, another topic that we could probably spend quite a bit of time talking and thinking about. Zoom in a bit. Yeah, different levels of anonymity. Explaining to participants how anonymity will be protected is obviously really important aspect of research design and consideration. Yes, certain backgrounds can privilege the way in which research is undertaken. Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you so much for all these lovely comments. Really thoughtful comments. So communication I've just touched on there. So that possibly segues me nicely into this next part about transparency and thinking about how we communicate research. So we've done quite a bit of work recently related to artificial intelligence in authorship. So some of the resources that I'm going to draw upon now are about are in relation to generative artificial intelligence. And I've also done some work about artificial intelligence transparency. And in this context, this was produced for Sheffield Hallam University, and we implemented that for this academic year. It's used in an assessment context, but it's designed to be used beyond assessment. So this transparency scale can be used for example, educators to communicate to students how artificial intelligence has been used in developing teaching materials. So it works in that context, just as it works for students communicating to educators how they have or haven't used artificial intelligence within their assessments, for example. So this was some work that we that started, I think, just over a year ago, and then we introduced it at the beginning of this academic year. So this is our current live method of talking about artificial intelligence use in assessment. And the approach that we took at Hallam, very briefly, just for context, we offered this out as you must use this or something else. So it wasn't that you had to use this. If you had a better way, you wanted to use a different school at a different scale or a different method entirely. Course teams had the agency to do that, but they must use something. And this was our baseline, if you like. So I'll probably estimate about 75% of courses are using this scale and 25% are using slightly different methods. So we're evaluating that at the moment. But anyway, don't want to take us too far off track, but just so that's kind of work that I've been doing about transparency in teaching and learning. And that has also translated to some of the work I'm going to talk about now about authorship and generative artificial intelligence, which of course is part of that picture of transparency and communication. So in my opinion, transparency really is an ethical principle, and it is that much more dominant principle now in higher education research and publishing. Now, why does it matter? With artificial intelligence tools really shifting our perspective over the last few years, it can influence analysis, it can influence interpretation of data and results, and it certainly can influence writing. We see much more commonly now and much more accepted that Gen AI is used in certain parts of the research publication process. and that we could have a long conversation again about the role of AI in writing and publication. But it is there. We are seeing it increasingly. There are some lines where we might say it's not acceptable to use it in this circumstance, and others where it is. Again, I don't want to go too much into detail about that. But when it's undisclosed or when it's unclear or where we haven't got a shared way of talking about it, that really does reduce trust, and it makes reviewing and looking at written work publications much more difficult. We can't trust that it is genuine. We can't trust where the human is and where the AI might have been responsible. So if we have a system or a shared understanding of how we can communicate that use of artificial intelligence, it really does help to become much more accountable. Just take another sip of tea. So this is the work that we did about authorship and generative AI. How can we ensure that colleagues understand where those lines are, what the purpose of using Gen AI is in publications, and how to disclose it in a transparent and ethical way? So what should you disclose? I've given a kind of list here, and you'll find much more information within this paper that we wrote, an authorship position that we wrote for the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice. But being clear about what tools you use, the purpose for using those, how you use the outputs and how they were amended, how this might have introduced limitations, and overall putting that transparency statement together, because it must be that the data and methods can be traceable, that you can confidently say how you did, what you did, when you did it, and with which tool. So it could be replicated by others. And never allow automated tools to make claims that you haven't checked and verified yourself. So it's all about openness and communication, of course, in plain English. So I would encourage you to have a look at our authorship statement. With the journal, we always take the angle of being very much in robustness and quality, but ultimately so practitioners can pick something up and use it and find it useful. And that's what we've tried to do with this authorship statement, excuse me. So if you have a look at this paper, you should find in there some really practical elements that help you consider if you should use AI at all within your work, and if you are going to use it, where it is ethical to do so and how you disclose that in a really transparent and ethical way. So yeah, lots more information there, not enough time to really go through all of that. So again, if we could have a think together now and add into these little notes here about thinking of the communication, transparency and communication, and how we communicate to participants, their expectations, how we are open about methods, limitations and tools, both to participants and in the final written piece, and how are we positioning our research so that it can be trusted, that it can be replicable, and that we're open about some of the challenges, because I think often it's quite easy to try and shy away or not hide, but be less focus less on the things that were difficult, the limitations of research. And actually, by being more open and transparent and communicating those, it actually improves the quality of the research and the engagement of others in that research. So how are we positioning the research to be trustworthy and replicable? And then thinking about principles of integrity, whether it's in a Gen AI context or more broadly. So how can we demonstrate integrity to people that are reading our work when it gets published? But yeah, thank you. The comments about participant information sheets are long, wordy and dense because they have to be. Yeah, I always try and write it as if I'm talking to somebody, but it ultimately ends up being several pages long. So then I've started to write almost an executive summary at the beginning of a participant information about this is the key things that you need to know. Hopefully that helps, but yeah, it ends up being such a long document because you're trying to cover every possibility. But trying to write in that plain English style, avoiding jargon, opening up the conversation, and putting things in simple terms can go a long way. Yeah, thank you. trying not to present the perfect research. It is so tempting to do that, trying to show that what you've done is really good. That it does feel sometimes that's talking about limitations does perhaps devalue the work that you've done. But actually, in my opinion, a really well written limitations section in a paper actually shows how thoughtful you've been about your research and how robust it is therefore becoming because you've thought about those limitations. Now, of course, what we all try and do is consider those limitations before we start and mitigate and counteract those before we get started. But there'll always be things that crop up in the research process that are limitations that we couldn't mitigate or didn't anticipate in the beginning. But being honest about those and sharing those in a paper do improve the integrity and level of trustworthy for that paper. Okay, thank you so much for the comments. Yes, this absolutely, particularly around AI. Journals often have different guidelines about what is expected or accepted, and it can be really difficult to really understand. One of the reasons why we published the authorship statement to make it a lot clearer. The editor-in-chief of the journal had published a previous guidance document, I think in 2023, about expectations of AI use in publications. But what we were seeing is that things had really shifted on in those last 3 years, and those expectations looked quite restrictive and not really aligned to common practice, which is why we developed the new updated position statement, because things have changed so much, and we all recognise just how rapidly artificial intelligence has moved on in the last couple of years. Yeah, transparency for different journals. Yeah, I think that things are moving. Perhaps they're moving away from scales more at the moment. That's what I've started to notice, a little bit more resistance to scale use, which is interesting, perhaps not unexpected. The move seems to be more about those disclosure statements and how you write a good disclosure statement, how you get that position right. So it'd be interesting to see how that moves on in the next year. Okay, right, let's see where we're up to. Just zoom out a bit. Okay, so the final bit is trying to bring this together a little bit, and perhaps I've been doing that as I've been going along actually, but thinking about how we connect research questions into those ethical considerations. I'm bringing in another piece of work here that was written by myself and the editor-in-chief of the journal. It was an editorial about ethical standards. In a similar way to the authorship statement, we wanted something that was clear about the expectations of ethical standards within the papers that we publish within the journal, but was also practical and really helped authors to produce great pieces of work. One, because the journal was obviously increasing in its own quality. It became top quartile. So we had those higher standards, but also to improve the impact of that work as well, to help authors have much more impactful excuse me, pieces of work. So this editorial was to really put that more clearly. This is the ethical considerations that we expect at the journal, and here is how you can ensure that your work is positioned in that way to ensure the best quality. So please do have a look at that. Hopefully you will find it helpful, as is the intention. So as I started at the beginning, really, with this position that research questions shape ethical considerations because they really help focus. They're going to help you focus what you study, how you study it, and who is affected by that research process. So coming back to those power and dynamics and relationships. So good research questions should define what data you need to be collecting. So if you think about student experiences, that can raise issues about privacy, confidentiality and data protection. And I've given an example there about how asking certain questions is going to increase risk more so than other questions. So thinking about the consequences of those research questions can help you get into those ethical considerations. Research questions will help shape the relationships and power dynamics that I've talked about. So those questions that involve your own students will introduce those power balances that I talked through. So consider how those relationships, well, how the questions, first of all, shape those relationships or are impacted with and by those relationships, and then impact consent, how much the students feel they can volunteer or otherwise, and perhaps a strong word, but how students might feel coerced or somewhat pressured into taking part into something that they may not otherwise want to. So yeah, another example there about asking students certain questions, even if those students, want to be positive or have a positive view, it can make students feel that they're unable to really give their honest view. Research questions will also determine the level of risk. So how much risk is introduced by the thing that you're trying to find the answer to, whether that's an emotional risk or a socially sensitive risk or other type of risk. You need to have safeguards in place, and indeed the safeguarding was something that we thought was very important as part of those ethical considerations and standards that were part of that paper. And so they also influence inclusion and fairness. So the way in which you ask or frame a question can include or exclude certain groups. So think very carefully that how does this question influence the equity or representation of the people that I want to be involved in my research? And check the assumptions that any research questions might be introducing. So access to resources and perhaps generative AI is a good example. Do all students have access to if you're looking at AI, that resource, that tool, or do some students have access to paid for tools that will give them advantages that others don't? So thinking about those assumptions that you might be making in that research process. They can shape your methodological choices. They very much dictate methods. They don't potentially shape, they will shape the methods that you are using to answer those questions, and that will bring in very much different implications. So observations will bring in, sorry about the typo, considerations of awareness, influence and consent. Interviews will raise matters of disclosure and any emotional impact. It depends obviously on the questions that you're asking, the topic, but everything will have an impact to some extent. So thinking very carefully about that. And then finally, that researcher intent and responsibility. So questions that may be reflecting your purpose and values, and poorly framed questions could potentially prioritise your gain over your participants' well-being. So coming back to that original point I was making, that research questions look quite simple on the surface, but actually they can be quite influential, and getting the time to think them through is really important because it'll pay off later on in your process. So for this last little part, where are we up to? 1:45, so we've got enough time to have some discussion, but have a think about these reflective prompts. So thinking about the relationship of research questions with ethics and how one can shape the other, and how a well-considered research question can improve the ethical standard of your work and improve the quality simultaneously. How can you use your early research questions as ethical checkpoints? And are there any ethical risks that you are introducing with the questions that you're asking? Who benefits from the study based on those research questions, and who might be overlooked or even disadvantaged? What ethical issues are built into how questions might be framed, and how might reframing it make impact more meaningful, but also more ethical, with higher integrity? So if you want to have a think about those prompts, have a think about the connection of research questions into ethics, and please do input some more of your brilliant comments into these little sticky notes. Be really pleased to see that. So while you're thinking about that, so hopefully it's clear now that ethics for me is not a compliance issue. It's a quality, integrity, transparency, opportunity. It's a place for us to really reflect on the quality of the research, the impact of the research, and that research questions, while simple on the face of it, actually are that cornerstone for starting off those ethical considerations and really thinking in detail about the integrity of your research, the quality of it, the robustness of it, and just how that interaction in educational research between yourself as researcher and or teacher and your students as participants, as well as obviously being students. So thinking about the two things and how interconnected they are, and by thinking about them as a tool for improving your research quality and impact. So, interested on your thoughts now and questions. Anything that might have arisen as I've talked through that has been a moment of revelation for you, perhaps, or yeah, that research questions are the cornerstone of everything. Louise.
Thank you, Alison. That was really interesting way of thinking about it, and I've not thought about these things in that same way before. In terms of the power of kind of connecting ethics to your research question, and that it's not. I guess, I guess I have always tended to see ethics as a bit of a gateway and a hurdle to have to get through, but actually, it's the foundation of a sort of fair and good quality research question, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
hopefully that whole process just helps the research become
Mm,
better quality so that when
mm,
you begin writing it up and ultimately submit to a journal like the Journal of University Teaching, Learning and Practice, that its likelihood of being accepted
mm,
is already
mm,
going to be higher because you've done that thinking and you've
mm,
thought about the interconnections and the relationships and all of those factors that I talked through. That it helps you, that sort of gives you that step up, if you like, to being better quality to start with.
mm. I think it is difficult, especially when we're wanting to do research with our own students. I think one way that's potentially helpful is just bringing students on board and co-creating the research with them in the first place.
Mhm.
Um, and I found that students recruiting students is slightly, you haven't got the same power dynamic there as us trying to recruit students, which is another thing to consider. And
Yeah,
and in terms of sharing the benefit as well, if you're doing the research with co-producing it with students, you've got students involved in designing and collecting data and in the writing up and in the authorship, then you're giving something back to students as well.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
there's a benefit for them, isn't there, that they're getting
Mm,
that research
mm, mm,
experience. Yeah.
mm,
Because there were comments, weren't there, about it can be really challenging to think about benefits for participants other than
mm, mm,
contributing to finding answers to things and expanding knowledge. Which many students are going to be interested in. But
mm,
I think it is looking for ways in which the process can be mutually beneficial and give
mm.
students something other than just responding as a participant. Yeah.
And in psychology and other related disciplines, we have a research participant panel. So students, obviously, they take courses in research design and research analysis, and so they can sign up to a panel where ongoing research projects are there that they can take part in, and that's gives them credit as a small part of their marks for a module. They get credit for taking part in those studies, just to learn as a participant what the experience is like and get exposure to the range of research studies that are going on. So, I've benefited within my discipline from having that pool of students who can volunteer to take part through a participant panel online, and then there isn't that same level of coercion that there might be if you're asking them in a class setting to
Mhm.
take part in something.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's so much to think about though, isn't there?
Mm,
That as I was
mm,
putting this presentation together, I thought, yeah, it sounds so simple on the face of it, but actually there's so many different
mm.
aspects to consider. Yeah.
Would anyone like to ask Alison a question?
Sure.
Sean.
Hi, yes. I wanted to add to what Louise was saying, actually. I was thinking about in action research. if somebody is doing research for their own students and they're using action research, how can you be sure that participation is genuinely voluntary in that instance?
Gosh, yeah, that's a great point, Sean. I'm trying to think of a nice, easy, short answer to it. I think I guess the first thing that comes to mind is really ensuring that there is a genuine opt-out available, so students can still benefit from engaging in that process, but without feeling that they are necessary as participants. But it's really difficult with action research to disentangle that from the overall process. So it has to be some really careful thought about design and what that opt-out looks like and how it's genuine and how students feel they can genuinely choose, so that you aren't advantaged by being part of the research and disadvantaged by not. But when it's so intertwined, it can be really challenging. Yeah, there isn't an easy answer, but it is that careful thought and design, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
Anyone else like to ask anything or share their own experience of trying to get ethical approval or designing research questions, designing ethical research questions?
Yeah.
Thank you, Alison.
Great. Hope people have found it interesting. And yeah, any feedback on the session? Quite interested in the Miro as a method. Like I say, I've used Padlet quite a few times, but Miro's gives that a little bit more flexibility. It's quite an interesting tool. So yeah, if anyone's got any feedback, there is that opportunity to add to those. I'll put those little red notes on.